Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this week's edition of the Thursday Talks on DME for Peace. My name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground. Today, I am delighted to welcome my Search for Common Ground colleague, Jimmy Sankaituah. Jimmy, I apologize. I was practicing really hard just before the start of this. And Jimmy is our country director of Sierra Leone and Liberia at Search. And Jimmy has joined us to lead a discussion on breaking the silence, the untold truths about Ebola. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A. I'm now going to hand over to today's guest, Jimmy. It's wonderful to have you on the Thursday Talks with us. Feel free to take it away when you're ready.
Thank you, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, wherever you are across the globe. It's an opportunity for me to be able to take up time to share my thoughts about our experience as an organization in the region during the outbreak of the Ebola crisis. And it is my hope that that experience will inform how each of us will participate or see the current context we find ourselves in. I chose to title my presentation The Untold Truths About the EVD. Of course, I want to try to provide you additional information which most people are not aware of about the Ebola crisis that engulfed the Mano River Union countries in 2014-2015, specifically in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Of course, as he said, my name is Joseph Jimmy Sankaituah. I work for Search, and I manage both the Liberia and Sierra Leone country offices. So, of course, I will try to present few slides looking at the introduction, the background of my presentation, the untold truths. I want to look at the limited political will that existed, the uncoordinated messaging, the disbelief and the myths that existed during the Ebola crisis. I'll also present briefly about Search's contribution to the response efforts and talk about the lessons we learned, and then how COVID-19 is being used based on the experience, and then I will conclude. Of course, here you will see the map of Sierra Leone and the way the cases were spread over a period up to the third quarter in the response efforts. So first, let me bring this into context. Before May 23rd, 2014, when the Ebola crisis struck, Sierra Leone had a very challenging and poor health system, especially because we had just come from a long, protracted civil crisis. And so that civil crisis also contributed to the state of the health sector in Sierra Leone. And the response effort at that time was associated with a lot of inexperienced response team members. Of course, the first case in Sierra Leone actually started on May 23, as I said. But beyond that, when the first case of Ebola struck, there were issues of denial, fear within the citizens. There were traditional practices which further made this difficult to prepare and respond to the pandemic. This was largely because all of us were quite unaware of the magnitude of the crisis that was hitting us at the time. By the third quarter of 2014, the virus had taken over the entire country, and health workers went on strike for better working conditions. So to just further reinforce my point about the weak health system and the way the health system was looking, while we were in the third quarter and the fight was so hard, then health workers now were demanding, better condition. By 2014, 100 cases of the virus were reported each day. By December 2014, 25 persons were dying daily. That is the extent to which things were getting bad. Even though 25 people per day cannot be compared to what we see in parts of the world, but in this part of the country, given our population, that was quite a huge number for us. By the time the World Health Organization declared Sierra Leone Ebola-free on November 7, 2015, we've had a total of 3,587 persons who have died, and there was 8,704 people who were infested by the virus. Moving forward, the COVID-19 is definitely building a bond on the lessons of the EVD. How did we come to the point I just described? First, the outbreak started in the southeast, which is the stronghold of the then opposition Sierra Leone People's Party. What that definitely meant was that the government didn't seem to have had the interest in really paying attention to what was happening in that part of the country. Of course, the government was unprepared in determining its own response. Even though the virus was in the Monrovia Union region for a couple of months before it entered Sierra Leone, the government still was not prepared. This was compounded by weak leadership and coordination at the onset of the outbreak. The government did not show clear direction. The space and opportunity for the participation of civil society organizations were limited. There were limited financial and human resources to intervene appropriately. Of course, as I said, while the government at the time were giving significant budgetary support to the health sector, the health system was still weak. There were challenges of financial capacity. There were challenges of human resource capacity, and there were also material limitations for the government to be able to respond. From our observation at the time, the government was waiting for donors to step forward, as always, before they can take up leadership. Unfortunately, that's the sad reality of our situation in this part of the world. There was another issue that confronted us as we were moving forward, issues around uncoordinated messaging. So initially, messaging and communication efforts were poorly coordinated. Of course, there were communication infrastructure in place, but they were poorly resourced. And of course, because they were poorly resourced, so was the human resource aspect of that. As those that are just being were confronting us, there were issues unfolding. Of course, spreading of rumors and myths about the virus and treatment. People were providing information about the virus and treatment options that were not true, which made it a bit difficult for us as well. Of course, traditional healing methods and the intake of herbs became an option. People felt that herbs would help them recover. Of course, they were listening to traditional healers because those are some of the ways they've also received treatment in the past. So they saw that as an option. People were hiding their sick loved ones and burying the dead in secret across the country. Migrating with sick and dying family members, honor cover was also prevalent across the entire response effort. When all of these things were happening, then stakeholders, including all of us, said to ourselves, we need to reconsider dates. We need to reconsider dates.
Everything okay, Jimmy?
Oh no, I had a network problem. I'm so sorry. So yeah, so I'm back on, right?
Problem.
Sorry.
You're doing great.
Sorry. So yes, okay, that's great. So when all of this were happening, we reached to a point as stakeholders across the country, both government, civil society, and other stakeholders said to ourselves, we need to do something. And then what did we do? We stepped forward, considered data, and begin to put together uniform messaging, hiding community mobilization, hiding awareness raising, and began to promote behavior change messaging and communication with the active involvement of all stakeholders, especially communities. In these processes, communities are very important. Even though we all came to the realization later that communities were an integral part of this process, we had to do all we can to bring communities into it. Sorry, this is freezing.
Don't worry, we all have tech challenges.
Okay, so you're following that way. So with this challenge came another challenge, issues around disbelief and myth. So imagine people have lived here for the last 500 years and have lived on eating bushmeat. To wake up one morning and walk to their doors and tell them that bushmeat, which has been your source of protein for over 500 years, has now become your killer, was hard to accept. It was hard to believe. Community lives and sources of livelihood were being disrupted because of the context they found themselves in and the messages we were passing on about bushmeat. There are communities who live on hunting bushmeat and selling bushmeat for livelihood. What that meant was that there was a big challenge about how do we get people to accept the reality that the country itself was faced with about the Ebola virus. We had to take one step forward to make sure that community residents and young people are actively involved in the response efforts, so that in that way, they are directly communicating to the elders, to the traditional leaders, and to everyone else whose participation was required to allow us to change the dynamics in the crisis. Having gone through all of these challenges, the question is, what was SUCH's contribution to all of this? So the first thing we did, having observed the way messages were being carved and delivered, we felt that there was a gap. And so the first thing we did as an organization was to find a way on the communication pillar of the National Response Center. That was a structure set up by the government to lead the response effort after we all realized that there was a need for government leadership. And so SUCH became a member of the communication pillar, which has been one of our niche. For those of you listening to me who do not know much about SUCH for Common Ground in Sierra Leone, one of the biggest leverage we have is the fact that our radio messages are quite respected in Sierra Leone. We then went to work and adapted one of our most popular radio programs called Atuna Ayana. Almost every Sierra Leonean you ask about Atuna Ayana, they know about it. So we went ahead to produce a special edition of that radio program that targeted on promoting behavior change in a way that allowed us to broadcast those messages on 27 radio stations. We're producing total 40 episodes of those radio programs. We produce jingles on varieties of themes, including stigma, transmission, treatment, rumor management, etc. At the end of all of that, we produce one Ebola awareness response, one Ebola documentary, which helped us to assess the impact our radio. I will share the link at the end of this presentation. Of course, key among that, we also focus on staff safety to make sure our staff and their family remain safe. That was quite also very important to us. But importantly, we saw the FMSA board, which is one of the government agencies, coming to us to say, look, we have infrastructure in SYZ places. We want to present those to you so that you use them to continue to reinforce the messages that you are passing on to the public. They had huge public address systems in very strategic locations, in bus parks, marketplaces. So we're loading those radio programs on flash drives and taking them to those places and broadcasting them over and over and again, so that people who are moving about, who do not have radio, will have access to the information we're providing. During the post-Ebola environment, we produced 5 short psychosocial videos in collaboration with CRS, which were used in counseling survivors. We created safe spaces for 180 women called Women Empowerment Centers in 6 of the most affected communities in 3 districts, Bomale, Poloko, and Pujonghun. I will share with you the link of the evaluation for that project. Of course, we did one outcome video. What were the lessons we learned out of all of this? And this is very important for those of you who are outside of this region and wanting to take steps and participate or contribute to the Ebola response in your localities. So first, accountability mechanism built in the response efforts can increase trust and reinforce accountability at all levels. For us to start these kinds of response accountability, both for police, financial accountability needs to be quite harnessed as we move into making decisions about the response efforts. There were lockdowns during the Ebola crisis. One thing we learned out of that was in poverty-stricken countries, restrictions and lockdowns need to be carefully planned, executed, and reviewed from time to time to avoid doing more harm than good. Lockdowns are intended to help the population. If we don't plan them carefully, if we don't execute them carefully, if we don't review them carefully, we might be doing more harm than good. We've now learned out of all of this, including the COVID-19, that no matter how resourced your health system is, demands during emergencies can overwhelm and undermine the system's capacity to respond. We have seen that all across the country. Even countries with very good health systems are unfortunately struggling to cope. There was increased awareness among government and its partners about the need to invest in health system strengthening. However, we have come to the realization that not that much is still needed in strengthening our health systems in Sierra Leone and in this part of the world. It goes to say that health emergency goes beyond medical personnel response. Community leadership and ownership has become increasingly important because it makes a big difference. Finally, on the lessons learned, uniform messaging as well as proper coordination at the onset of the response can lend credibility and trust to efforts of all stakeholders in the response. One may ask, how has the experience informed current efforts, especially in Sierra Leone? Let me hasten to say, SEARCH has not directly gotten involved with the response effort. We are still observing what's happening. But lastly, what we're seeing is that the government has taken full charge of the response and is providing leadership. Of course, this is what we expect. The first step on the part of the government was, one, suspending airlines, setting up quarantine facility at the airports, declaring state of public health emergency. Secondly, which was very important for us, the government recognized that those who were actively involved in the response had local knowledge. And so invited local experts to talk about how to begin the response efforts, which I think is very, very important. This is actively providing the space for all stakeholders to coordinate and participate. I think because of all of the recognition in the efforts, Sierra Leone was one of the last countries in this MRU region to report a case on March 31, 2020. And as of today, we've had 65 cases, and 10 recovery with 1 death just yesterday. And to conclude my presentation, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to share with you the link for the video that you can go and hear citizens giving us feedback about our work. And also, you can read the evaluation of our women empowerment project around women affected by Ebola. The project we did, you can read the evaluation and see exactly the impact we made. So I'd like to stop thus far and turn it over to the moderator so that we continue the conversation one-on-one.
Jimmy, that is fantastic. And just a note, as your slides stopped on the uncoordinated messaging slide, we will post those alongside the recording on DME for Peace later today. We will also make sure that you get access to the resources that Jimmy referenced at the end of his presentation. Now, to the audience, this is your time to shine. We're opening up today's presentation to your questions. A couple of notes about our format. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday Talks, you can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, which will allow you to type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon. This will raise your hand. That will allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and learn from our discussion. Jimmy, one of the sort of striking things I found from your presentation is there are huge parallels from how many governments have responded to coronavirus in sort of if you want to say the global north or the global west, in the initial response to the crisis compared to how Sierra Leone initially responded to Ebola. And I think that's just another sign of the lessons we can learn, that we're not properly prepared for crises like this. But I want to ask you a question about Sierra Leone right now. You provided a bit of context as to sort of what the situation is on the ground and how many cases you guys have. But have steps been taken to ensure lockdown or have self-isolation measures being introduced? I can imagine this is incredibly difficult in a country with sort of a huge population of less well-off people, as well as rural communities.
I think the lessons the government drew out of the Ebola crisis, including all the lockdowns that took place during the crisis, is the fact that they have been very respectful of how they institute measures. They are giving sufficient time to citizens to prepare for each of the lockdown they've done. For example, there was a 3 days lockdown. They gave sufficient time for citizens to prepare. There was a inter-district lockdown where districts cannot go over to another district except you have pass to go through. They've been able to communicate that, clarify before they put the measure into place. And I think we didn't see most of those in the Ebola time, which created tension between state institutions and citizens. This time around, it's not happening because I think the government is adequately communicating with citizens about what they will do and how they want to do it. Because clarifying government decisions can be sometimes messy in most environments. So in this case, in my view, I think the government is doing very well with the way she's communicating her actions and clarifying what needs to be done and what needs not to be done.
Great, thank you, Jimmy. Our next question comes from Colin Jacobs. And Colin is an independent consultant in the UK. And Colin writes, apart from the use of bushmeat, what were the other practices that were needed to be changed, and how sustainable have these changes proved?
So one of the troubling changes was the issue about washing the dead. I mean, traditionally here, when people die, family members will have to wash the dead and treat the dead, give them their last honor before they get buried. That was posing a serious challenge for the response team. So we had to go back to reconsider dates and then begin to communicate about dignified burying. So that way we started supporting people to make sure that they are not doing a burying, but that they understand that we are in an emergency and there was a need for them to refrain from washing the dead before burial.
Great, thank you, Jimmy. Our next question comes from Timothy Ellinger. And Timothy writes, can you comment on how Ebola and the fallout from Ebola may or may not have contributed to the change in government or political problems today? Like, was there a lasting effect regarding sort of political problems or towards government actions in Sierra Leone?
I think one of the things I personally appreciated was the fact that the government invited the response team, those who were leading the response team during the Ebola crisis. And as Sierra Leone, if you don't know Sierra Leone is a country divided in the middle between two political parties from two regions of the country. So one group is in power. Sometimes, lastly, the other group has nothing to do with that group except to criticize. In this case, the government didn't look at which region those who were managing the response came from. but invited them to sit and talk about how the country, the Republic of Sierra Leone, can participate and jointly work towards combating COVID-19. And so I think that was a very good example that countries that have similar kind of political geography can learn from, because response of this nature requires all hands on deck to achieve.
Thank you, Jimmy. I think that's a really good point. We've got quite a few questions on this topic, and I'm going to try and sort of coalesce them into one sort of coherent question. Obviously, there were a number of behavioral changes that happened in Sierra Leone as a result of the Ebola crisis. I'm wondering, how have these sort of cultural norm changes or those behavioral changes been sustained since sort of the end of the Ebola crisis?
I mean, quite frankly, I cannot indicate which one of them were sustained. But the benefit is that when the government, I mean, when the COVID-19 situation was announced, it was easier for people to adapt. In fact, we've seen creativity around communities where people are producing new set of hand washing machines that are electronically built, and so people have adapted. Everyone now has no resistance. We haven't heard of people resisting some of the protocols that have been put in place, because those were largely the same protocols that we're using at the time. So as of today, I know people went back to eating bush meat, people went back to hunting bush meat, people gone back to washing the dead. There are a lot of other things that have continued since after the Ebola crisis, because of course some communities actually resisted the sources of the Ebola virus, and so they still believe today what it is. But what I do know is that the experience has informed how people quickly adapt the new context they find themselves in.
Thanks, Jimmy. I think one of the most important things that we can take away from your presentation today is the importance of communication. I think we've all of us on this call have either sort of heard rumors or been involved in rumor spreading accidentally in the past in some ways. So coordinated messaging can make a big impact in these crises. So our question comes from Kimmy Peterson, and Kimmy is an independent consultant from Denmark. And Kimmy writes, to what extent were messages shared with communities for further dissemination through radio? Were they coordinated or harmonized with the government? I.e., were search and the government working together to share a message?
Yes, definitely. I mean, messaging first. Search. We worked with 27 radio stations across the entire country. There's a network of community radio stations that Search is a member of the BO called the Independent Radio Network. That network of community radio stations covers significant, more than 90% of the population in the country. And so Search has been producing radio programs for the last 14 years, just about the time of the crisis. And our radio messages are respected. It resonates with Sierra Leoneans, and they take our messages into high esteem, coming from the civil crisis coming from the end of the civil crisis, the role we played and moving forward. So it was that leverage that we used to work with the government to be able to reinforce the messages that were being passed down around behavior change communication. As I said, our radio programs are targeted at behavior change. So it was easier for us to adapt. And if you go back to the video and listen to what citizens say about our radio programs, what impact it made on them, you will appreciate exactly the role Search played throughout this process.
And so, Jimmy, obviously those coordinated messages are important, but one of the other facets of coherent messaging and impactful messaging is also countering rumors. So how did you do some myth busting? How did you guys work to sort of counter rumors within the communities? What efforts did you guys take?
So at some point at the beginning, everyone was putting out messages that they felt was helpful, but they were actually harmful. So with time, there was a strong demand from government that all messages are clear with the Ministry of Health, where the WHO and others were supporting. And because the radio stations are based in the local communities with whom we work, it was easier for them to verify information coming that they weren't quite sure about. And what we were doing was to dramatize largely the information that we wanted citizens to be aware of about the response efforts, both from down and from up. We were also asking citizens to send us feedback, on through text messages, and to send us information that they wanted clarity on. And all of those information were gathered and fed back into our radio programs for production. So those were the way we were countering some of the rumors that were going about. Because of course,
I think that that incorporating those feedback loops, making sure that you are regularly adapting your programming and your messaging to respond to the current needs is really really insightful, as well as important to make sure that we're constantly at the coalface. I guess I have a question kind of around what you learned from the process. If there were things that you could have done better in response to the Ebola crisis, and you can apply some of those lessons to coronavirus, what would those sort of key lessons be that you would try to improve upon?
So at the organizational level, first,
organizational from a response level in general.
Yes, search from the response level is to prepare our team, our team in country, to be aware of our role as an organization that provides the kind of information that people need to be able to move forward in terms of the things they need to do. The second thing is that while government takes the lead, it's important for us to continue to engage with state institutions that have very important role to play in the response process. One of the things that I think will be quite important is how we engage in the post environment after all of this is done. How we go about engaging communities will be quite important to understanding some of the cultural changes that will take place moving forward. I think those are some of the key considerations I will have in terms of looking at the current context, but also looking beyond the context where we find ourselves.
Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, and just a reiteration to the audience, this is a discussion for you guys to ask your questions, to write your questions, or please raise your hand, and we would love to unmute your microphone to hear your beautiful voices so that you can stop hearing me talk. But our next question, Jimmy, comes from Carla White. And Carla writes, can you explain more about the messaging about what to do when someone was sick? Because there was no treatment available in the health system, what were they told to do?
So that's an interesting question, right? So first, it was clear to all of us that there was no treatment for the Ebola virus. What we were encouraging people to do is to report as early as they can whenever they see signs and symptoms. That was very important, so that the authorities will step forward to provide support. We were encouraging family members not to keep sick people in the house, not to hold on to the sick in their homes, because it will affect them seriously. Because of course, as you know, Ebola spreads through bodily fluids. And so if you have a family member inside your house with you, there's a tendency that you will get contaminated. So the best you can do to save the rest of the family is to report to the government line, so that the team will come over to help take that person to the hospital. I think those are the only things we could do in terms of passing on the messages that will help people to be able to report early. Because reporting early, there was a likelihood that you might survive instead of staying at home and the sickness gets worse. Because remember, the first set of messages that came out was that over 90% of those who contract the virus died. And so we had to change that to give people the motivation to be able to step forward and go to hospital as early as they can. That was the only message we were passing on. Because we didn't also want to encourage people to start treating people at home. Because by giving people options about what they can do when someone gets sick, you'll be making things worse. Because Ebola was highly contagious.
And I think, Jimmy, this gets, you've sort of touched on that and nearly basically answered the question from Elizabeth Harrock, who is a consultant with UNICEF. And Elizabeth writes, how did you work to overcome the reliance on traditional healing methods and stigma to do with Ebola while continuing to respect cultural norms?
I think I spoke about issues about social mobilization. I spoke about issues of helping, about getting community people to get involved into the response efforts. And then also targeting traditional leaders. Those that were the social mobilizers were asked to target traditional leaders and help them abandon some of the traditional practices that were harmful to the response efforts. So those were some of the ways we managed to get things going.
Great. Thank you very much, Jimmy. I think one of the things that's been asked by a number of people, and most recently by Graham Carrington, the reason I say Graham's name is right in front of me right now, is that, you know, the message is often really important, but often the choice of messenger matters more. So what is your experience in choosing sort of the right sort of champions to share your message, or choosing the right channels to share your message?
So as I said, we have a lot of credibility with the population of Sierra Leone when it comes to traditional radio messaging. So one of the things we insisted on was to sustain our airtime. The time that citizens listen to our radio program, we kept that time. We did not change the name of our most popular radio program. We produced a special edition, so people continue to follow it. But this time around, the characters were adapted to the context. So in that way, we're trying to make sure that citizens continue to follow our leads, but they are also receiving different set of messages that support the response efforts.
Great, thank you, Jimmy. Our next question comes from actually one of our last Thursday talk hosts, Ritu Nanda. Ritu writes, you mentioned the importance of community ownership and leadership in the Ebola response. Could you share an example to explain what role communities can play in the response to a pandemic?
So first, we always honor the assumption that communities don't have knowledge and they don't have capacity. That's not true. So the first thing was, of course, when the crisis started, communities were very resistant because they didn't trust what people were saying to them. So as I said in my presentation, one of the ways to limit that was to get them involved, to begin to speak to local leadership, engage communities, mobilize communities, and allow them to drive the process. So when you start recruiting people from the community who people know, training them and redeploying them in those communities, you are sending a message indirectly to the population to say, look, your people, your children are with us. They are supporting this cause. So we want you to listen to your children. And so because they trust their children, they trust those who come from the community, it's easier for them to be able to listen, understand, and appreciate the message you're passing on to them. So that's how you drive community ownership. You get leaders in the community to take charge of the response efforts. You go through them to reach out to the larger audience of the community. Because if you come from outside and you want to go to the community and tell people what they can do and what they cannot do, sometimes they will resist. And that's exactly what was happening. Communities were resisting people and health workers and the messages that were coming to them. But when the strategy got changed, whereby most of what was happening was going through communities, You listen to your radio station, for example, the community owned the community radio. They've lived with the radio staff, the broadcasters that are within the radio station, the leadership of the radio station. They know them. They know their voices. So when those people begin to talk to them about what was happening, they now stopped and thought about what they needed to do to save their community.
That is a really insightful answer, Jimmy. I really appreciate that. One of our last questions is going to come from Owen O'Leary. And Owen writes, and I know we talked about the social and cultural changes that we noticed as a result of the response to Ebola, but did we see any lasting impacts on the conflict dynamics? Either good in that, you know, health crisis bring people together, or negative, it reduced the contact between different groups?
There were a lot of dynamics that we saw changing. For example, I talk about a project we manage with women, recognizing here that traditionally women have been excluded. Because everyone was involved and had a role to play in a response efforts, it was easier for us to get men to provide a space for women to join into community level decision making. For example, if you read a final evaluation of that project, almost about more than 80% of community leaders with whom our evaluators spoke said that because of the project, there was a shift in how men were treating their wives at home, thereby minimizing the number of cases that were being reported to them as chiefs to judge on a weekly basis, which I think was important. But also importantly, I mean, investing companies, institutions that are traditionally male-dominated began to open up largely to allow women to participate. For example, Surfing is a oil palm million dollar company in Sierra Leone. They at the end of the price, they opened up the grievance committee of the workforce to allow women, some of those women with whom we were working, to sit on the grievance committee, where decisions about the welfare of workers and communities that were affected were made. So those kinds of smaller changes were taking place, but we thought those were quite important changes that were taking place in terms of building a new society and moving forward. So those examples are everywhere. Those structural changes, not significantly as you might expect, but those changes took place in communities where we all work to improve the livelihood of people and the way they do business, the way they make decisions, and the way they engage.
Great, thanks, Jimmy. And I think we have time for one last question. And apologies if we didn't get to yours today. I tried my best to mold as many together as possible when we got the chance. But this question comes from our colleague and your sort of office mate, Tommy McCarthy of Search Sierra Leone. And Tommy writes, Jimmy, can you please explain further the impact of the staying home experience and how that staying at home affected people in the fight against Ebola, and how that might help in our messaging and fight against COVID-19?
So first, as I said, as one of the lessons we learned, when we want to let people stay home, we have to communicate in time for people to prepare. We have to review that decision from time to time. The impact on individuals, groups, and communities were different from one part of the country to another. For example, people in urban communities felt the lockdown more than those who are in rural communities. Because for rural community people, their life remains the same. Nothing is changing. They go to their farm, they come back home. But in urban communities where people have to leave their houses to go and fend for bread, to come back home in the evening before their family get a meal, it was quite tough for them. And I think that is a cue that the government took while she's taking her time to respond when it comes to lockdown, clarifying, making sure there's sufficient time for people to prepare before going into lockdown. And when they are in lockdown, they are also supported. For example, the government made it its business to provide water and electricity, not on a 24-hour basis, but at least to cover a good number of hours when people are home, which was not the case before. Sarah is reading here heavily, so I have to talk loud for you to understand me, which was not the case before. So if you lock people indoors and you don't give them water, you don't give them electricity in urban communities, you are definitely creating another set of problems that might undermine their health and safety.
Wow, Jimmy, what a note to finish on, and some definite nuggets for us to take forward as we think about our global response to coronavirus. And with that, I think we're just about finished for today. Thank you, Jimmy, for a wonderful presentation and such a great discussion. Thank you to our audience for asking so many questions. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to join us and your continued support of DME for Peace and these Thursday Talk webinars. We had well over 100 people join us today and contribute to the discussion, a lot of new faces. So I hope to see you online again in the near future. A couple of announcements before we wrap up today's webinar. The first is a reminder to apply for the Connections program by DME for Peace. In this time of isolation, we need to connect more than ever. DME for Peace is creating a platform for digital connections between peace builders around the world, and I'm going to put the link to that in your chat box. So please feel free to encourage your colleagues to apply. It is open to anyone in any country. We will do our best to try and set up learning relationships between people in this time of isolation. So that link is in your chat box right now. And then over the next few months, we're going to be running a series on technology and peace building. We're going to be discussing how you can digitally adapt your programs, the questions you need to consider, run through ideas like online facilitation and training development, as well as showcase some of the bright spots and innovations in our field related to COVID-19. We're going to be working with some of the most exciting and interesting organizations, not only in the peace building field, but in the technology space. So look out for more information on that campaign in your inboxes soon. And yeah, once again, Jimmy, thank you so much for being a great guest today. I hope to have you on again sometime soon. And to our audience, I hope to see you online in the not too distant future.
Thank you, it's my pleasure.
Great. Everyone, take care, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you soon.